Good morning, everybody. Welcome. They tell the story of a Jewish guy who is going through some hard financial times, and Pesach is coming up. There's a lot of expenses. He has to buy matzahs, wine, meat, new clothes for the kids. And his wife says to him, how are we going to afford the Yontiv? And he says, I'm not sure, I don't know. And she says, well, come up with something. He's been out of work now for months. Just go and get a job, do something. Anyway, he's walking around the streets, he's thinking. He came up with an idea. He went to the hairdresser to get his hair done. And he's sitting there getting his hair cut. And he says to the hairdresser, do me a favor, can you cut off my eyebrows? The hairdresser says, okay, fine. So he takes out the razor and cuts off his eyebrows. One of them shaves it completely off. Just before he does the second one, the guy says, hey, what did you do? Are you crazy? Have you ever heard of a hairdresser cutting eyebrows off? I'm taking you to court. I'm suing you for this. And he takes him to court and he makes a bit of money out of it. He does pretty well. Comes home with a fortune. His wife's delighted. She says, fantastic, we've got money for Yontiv now. She says, but you've only got one eyebrow now. I think you should shave the other one off to look a bit more normal. And he says, no, I'm saving that one for Rosh Hashanah. Eyebrows is not really a topic that's often discussed in public. It's not a major theme in Judaism either, but there is one place where eyebrows are made a bit of a big deal of, and that is the eyebrows of a Kohen, of a priest. There's a section in the book of Leviticus that says that there are certain physical blemishes that make a Kohen, a priest, invalid to serve in the temple. And if a Kohen, he may have the right pedigree, he comes from the right family, he's a Kohen, maybe a lovely guy, but if he's got these particular blemishes, he's invalid to serve in the temple. One of them is long eyebrows. I want to look at this and try and understand it, because at first glance it seems really, really puzzling. So the Torah says in the book of Leviticus that God says to speak to Aaron, the Kohen, and tell him that any man amongst your offspring throughout their generations who has a defect shall not come near to offer up God's food. He can't participate in the sacrifices. Any man who has a defect should not approach, for example, a blind man. It lists the defects. A blind man, a lame one, or one with a sunken nose, or with mismatching limbs. Okay, so blind or lame, fine. A sunken nose means a nose that sunk between the eyes, or mismatching limbs where one leg is longer than the other. These people cannot bring sacrifices, cannot work in the temple. Or a man who has a broken leg or a broken arm, or one with long eyebrows, or a cataract, or a commingling in his eye, meaning a mixing of the colors, the white and the black of the eye are mixed up, dry lesions or weeping sores, or one with crushed testicles. These people cannot serve in the temple, simply because they have these physical defects. Blemishes. This list of blemishes seem a bit unfair. just because a Kohen has these particular blemishes, they shouldn't serve in the temple. What's he done wrong? We'd understand if we said that a Kohen who steals, a Kohen who lies, who cheats, who treats people unfairly is invalid to be serving in the temple. Okay, that makes sense. But a Kohen, just because he's got long eyebrows, or he broke his foot, or one leg is longer than the other, that invalidates him from serving in the temple. It doesn't seem to have any moral content to it. And so it's very strange at first.
Those are things that are possible. It's going to be
Well, if he's a Rasha, if he's convicted with witnesses as a wicked person, then no, he can't be Kohen.
So is he only prohibited from serving? Say he's got a broken leg, but it's when the leg heals, isn't it?
It's okay once it passes. So this question has been dealt with, like any question we come up with in the Torah. It's been dealt with by the commentaries over the years. We're not the first to ask it. And anytime anything in the Torah seems unusual, out of place, or doesn't quite make sense, so we can always rely that the sages over the generations have observed those difficulties and have dealt with them and answered them. And indeed, this question is something that has been dealt with by the various thinkers over the ages in different ways, and in fascinatingly different ways. And we're going to go on a bit of a journey through Jewish philosophy and mysticism, the Hasidic thinking, and try and come up with a bit of an understanding of why the Torah would prohibit a Kohen with long eyebrows or other seemingly superficial defects from serving in the temple. So I want to start off with the great Maimonides, Rambam. Maimonides, we know as the great philosopher, who often had the ability to give rational explanations to that which seemed irrational. And in his Guide to the Perplexed, which is his masterpiece of philosophy, where he attempted to rationalize much of Judaism, his target audience was the Jewish community at his time, who had become very enamored with Greek philosophy, which was very logical and systematic. And there was a critique against Judaism at the time that Judaism was mystical and faith-based without any logic and rationale. To us that sounds crazy, such an idea, but that's what people said at the time. And so he tried to show how rational much of Judaism is in the Guide to the Perplexed. And so here he's explaining, so why would the Torah prohibit a Kohen with a physical defect, totally external, to serve in the temple? His explanation was like this, that human nature is that we are superficial beings. People see the surface. We see the outside. When you look at a person, what you see is not their inner character, not their deepest soul. You just see their physical body. People are superficial, and we do form judgments based on the way a person looks externally. And so Maimonides writes that because the temple is the house of God, it has to be held in the highest esteem. So if people serving in the temple have physical defects that make them stick out and look strange, so the respect and the honor for the temple will be diminished. Not that this is right. Maimonides seems to be saying this is somehow a recognition of the weakness of human nature, that we do judge by the externalities, and really we should be able to see beyond it. We should be able to look at a Kohen who has long eyebrows and say, okay, well, but that's his eyebrows, that's not who he is, and that shouldn't be a problem for us. However, whether we want to or not, we will somehow look down at the temple and its service if the people who serve it in the temple look strange, unusual, or out of place. So therefore, these defects, such as long eyebrows that will distract from the honor of the temple, they are prohibited, they're restricted from serving in the temple. That's Maimonides' rationale for it. Now, we could have a few questions on that one. Do you have any? Does it make sense?
I mean, you can still be quite ugly, physically quite grotesque, and not have any of those characteristics.
Yep. The Torah only listed quite specific blemishes. There are other blemishes that a person could have. Someone could have a gigantic nose. Lots of Jewish people do, and that was not listed as one of the defects. If the Torah would have said any unusual, strange looking thing invalidates the Kohen, so then that would make sense. But it seems quite specific. So not what Maimonides said is a valid point, but it doesn't seem to comprehensively explain why a Kohen with a defect can't serve in the temple, just because it's going to diminish the respect of the temple. Also, some of the listed ones are not so visible to the outside world. You wouldn't notice them, so it doesn't fully explain it. Nevertheless, that's one idea that Maimonides put forth as to explain this concept. The Sefer Chinuch went a bit further. The Sefer Chinuch is a book believed to be written by a sage called Rabbi Aaron Halevi, who was from the city of Barcelona in Spain. Also around the 1200s, he was writing for his son, who was becoming bar mitzvah. He wrote what became a book explaining the 613 commandments and the background to them in a basic, concise way. One by one goes through the entire 613 commandments, and it was for his son becoming bar mitzvah, who needs to keep the commandments, that he should know what he's doing. But the book became a classic, and it's a basic fundamental work of Jewish law and an understanding of the mitzvahs. And it's called Sefer Chinuch, the Book of Education. So here also what he does is every mitzvah he gives the brief outline of the laws of the mitzvah, and then a bit of a rationale and explanation for the mitzvah. So when he's talking about this particular mitzvah, the mitzvah of the restriction of Kohanim, who have blemishes serving in the temple. So he first quotes the same idea as the Rambam, the Maimonides, the idea that the respect for the temple will be diminished if those who serve in it look strange. But he takes it a step further, and he says that something that we don't appreciate about the temple, because we haven't experienced it, was that the temple service and everything that went on in the temple was all symbolic and had spiritual significance and meaning. The Kohanim, the priests in the temple, whether they'd be slaughtering the animals, pouring the blood of the animals, putting the parts of the animal on the altar and burning it up, all the various movements that were done in the temple were all symbolic and all had spiritual meaning. And there would be an audience watching a lot of the stuff. The Israelites would stand in the temple and watch the Kohanim and doing what they're doing. And it would be like a meditation. That by watching the Kohanim doing what they're doing, everything they did would symbolize something, and the people would meditate on what it symbolized, and it would create a heightened spiritual state. In brief, it's explained in some of the Hasidic works what some of the symbolism of the sacrificial service was. The idea of the animal being burnt up on the altar of God represented the animalistic part of the human being. That we also have an animal part of ourselves, and that being burnt on the altar means taking the animalistic drives of the human being and bringing them, elevating them, sublimating them towards godliness, transforming our lowly drives and elevating them to a higher place. So much of the temple service of burning the sacrifices, it had symbolism, it had meaning, and people at the time understood what that meaning was. So they would watch the Kohanim do their service, and that would serve as a stimulus for a meditation. So therefore the Kohanim had to be very focused in what they were doing, and the people watching them also had to be focused on the higher meaning of what was happening. It says the Sefer Chinuch that a Kohen who had long eyebrows or some other external abnormality would distract from that meditation, would make that focus very difficult. Because their look would be so unusual, it would just it would be a distraction. And so that, says the Sefer Chinuch, is a reason why a Kohen with a physical blemish could not serve in the temple. It would put off the people who are meditating on every move that they make. So that's similar to what the Rambam said, similar to Maimonides' idea that it's somehow lessening the idea of what's going on in the temple. But again, that reason should apply to any blemish, any external blemish, not just one that is listed in the Torah. So it doesn't seem to fully explain why a blemished Kohen cannot serve in the temple. Yeah. Well, there's no temple, so no, it doesn't apply. So a Kohen with long eyebrows can still go up to the duchening, and although it does say that if he's very strange looking, that will also be distracting. It does say in halacha that a Kohen who has some very strange people will, because you're not supposed to look at the Kohanim when they go up, and people will look if he's looking like that. Now there's an interesting comment by the Kli Yakar. Kli Yakar is one of the commentaries, a later commentary on the Torah, who says a bit more specifically about the blemishes that are listed in the Torah itself. Because the answers we've looked at until now would apply to any external blemish. He says that no, there's something specific about the blemishes listed in the Torah. And there's a reason why these blemishes are listed as invalidating a Kohen and not other ones. The Kli Yakar says that if you look carefully at the wording in the Torah, the tense is a little bit out of place. It says that God said to speak to the children of Aaron, who are the Kohanim, and tell them that any man who will have a blemish from amongst the Kohanim cannot serve in the temple. The tense is in future. Any man who will have a blemish cannot serve in the temple. It should just say any man who has a blemish should not serve in the temple, and then it lists the blemishes. Why does it say in the future tense, any man who will have a blemish? So the Kli Yakar answers a fascinating answer. He says that the ancients had a wisdom that they could look at a person's personality, and from their character and personality they would know which blemishes were going to develop. Because every physical blemish was actually a symptom of an inner moral failing. not every blemish that happens, but these particular ones that are listed are an external sign of an inner moral problem. And so the ancients would know which blemish was going to come before it even came, by knowing the person's character. And so he ingeniously explains this section of the Torah as saying that any Kohen who will have a blemish shouldn't serve in the temple. Don't wait until the blemish comes. When somebody has the moral defect that is going to cause the physical blemish that is listed below, so then that Kohen should already be invalidated and not be a part of the service in the temple. And that's why the tense is future, because they're already anticipating the blemish that's going to come. And he says that they had an understanding in those times, which we don't have because we don't have the temple, but they had an understanding of which blemish was going to come based on which personality flaw. So he gives a couple of examples which are interesting. He says, like, for example, somebody who was easy to bribe, somebody who accepted bribes, a Kohen. Often the Kohanim also served as judges. And if a judge would accept bribes in court, so then such a person, their eyesight would be affected. Why? Why would your eyesight be affected by accepting bribes? Because yeah, because it says that, actually in the Torah it says that bribes blind the wise. That the wise person will be blinded by bribes. You don't see truth, you don't see the facts when you accept a bribe. You see things in a skewed way. So, yes, so a bribe has the power to affect eyesight. In those times when people were more spiritually heightened, so often physical defects were actually a direct result of a spiritual failing. So somebody who would accept bribes, their eyesight would be affected. We can't say that today. Somebody who has bad eyesight today, we can't say, "Ooh, I know something about him. That person has been taking bribes." No, we're because of our spiritual lowliness, we're not so connected. So therefore, our body and soul are not necessarily in sync as much today, and therefore our eyesight is not necessarily a symptom of a failing morally. But in those times it was, particularly for a Kohen. So if a Kohen would take bribes, their eyesight would be affected. And that's why in the list of blemishes, somebody whose eyes are affected, their eyesight, or the eyebrows also is the covering of the eyes. That there's like a blinkers over the eyes.
So was it understood that this relation between the blemish and the physical and the spiritual side, the moral side of the person, was just amongst the Kohen, or did that apply to sort of Levites? It
could be with anyone. It could be with anyone, but specifically the Kohanim who were serving in the temple, they were a high level of spirituality was expected of them, and also there was more of an obvious connection between their body and their soul. So it was something specific to Kohanim, but it could apply to anyone, and so that's why it's saying before they even develop the blemish. When you pick up somebody who's got this moral defect, they can't be a priest. The other example he gives is one of the defects was a broken leg, if they break their leg. So he says that was as a result of walking arrogantly. Somebody who would walk with an arrogant walk, with using their position of power to sort of condescend. So that would affect their walking. They'd break their leg. They'd break a leg. So again, it's not that you have to wait for the Kohen to break his leg to invalidate him. An arrogant Kohen was invalidated from serving in the temple. So the Kli Yakar explains that these blemishes as merely being symptoms of an inner failing, and therefore before they even come, when they're going to come, you invalidate a Kohen, which is a fascinating idea. This is reflected in another comment that is found in the book called Pardes Yosef. It's a collection of mainly Hasidic interpretations of the Torah. And there it says that the same idea but in a slightly different way. That the Kli Yakar, which we just looked at, says that when you see a person who's got the moral blemish, you know that the physical blemish is going to come, so you can validate him already. The Paradis Yosef says it in a slightly different way. He says that we, human beings, we don't really know people's inner life. We don't know what's going on inside of their heart, and so therefore very often it will be hard for us to judge whether somebody's morally up to being a priest or not. How are we supposed to know? So God designed it in such a way that these particular blemishes will appear on a Kohen if he is invalid to be a Kohen, if he's not appropriate to be a Kohen. It's our sign, it's a symbol that God is sending us to say, don't let this person be a Kohen. In other words, the long eyebrows on a Kohen is not just because he's got long eyebrows, it's because there is some moral defect that makes him inappropriate for serving in the temple and representing the Jewish people in front of God. It's not his long eyebrows that's the problem. The long eyebrows are the alert that we're being given to not let this person be a Kohen. So God lists a bunch of particular blemishes as this is our code language. When you see a blemish like this in a Kohen, it's my message to you not to let him be a Kohen. Not because long eyebrows or a limp, because he's got one leg longer than the other. That's not the problem. That is just the alert that I'm giving you. And so this, he says, only applies to Kohanim in the temple. Nobody else. While what the Kli Yakar said could apply to anybody, anyone who takes bribes could end up losing their eyesight in those times. However, this idea, the idea that these blemishes are an alert to not let the person be a Kohen, you can only apply that to a Kohen, because Hashem only needs to give us that message in reference to Kohanim serving in the temple. Whereas somebody else who has long eyebrows doesn't mean God is telling you don't be friends with this person because they've got long eyebrows. There's nothing wrong with long eyebrows. It's specifically a message to not let a Kohen be a priest, be serve in the temple. That's what the Paradis Yosef says, a fascinating thought. This idea is developed also in a book called Arvei Nachal. Arvei Nachal was another Hasidic interpretation of the Torah, where he says that you can see this hinted at, this idea that the physical blemish is a sign of an inner failing, is hinted at in the very word for blemish in Hebrew. The Hebrew word for blemish is mum. And mum is an interesting word because, first of all, the word mum is, you can read it backwards, and it's the same, mem vav mem. It's the same word backwards. So inside and out, the person is completely blemished. It's not just an external thing, but it's also an internal thing. But even more specific to that, the three letters of the word mum, which means blemish in Hebrew, mem, vav, mem. Now these letters in the Hebrew alphabet, mem, vav, and mem, are interesting in that every letter in Hebrew you can spell out the letter. In other words, the letter mem is a word, mem, which is spelt mem, mem. The letter vav, the word vav is spelled vav, vav. I don't think this works in English. You can't really spell out A, B, C, D. You can't actually spell out them as words, really. Some of them you could, but we don't have a spelling for them. Whereas in Hebrew, there's a spelling for each letter, how it's pronounced. So, like Aleph is Aleph Lamed Vei. Aleph, it's an actual word. So to the letters of Mum, Mem, Vav, Mem. So Mem is Mem, Mem, Vav is Vav, Vav, and Mem is Mem, Mem. What's interesting about these letters is that the hidden letter of the letter is the same as the revealed letter. In other words, Mem is spelled Mem, Mem. Vav is spelled Vav, Vav. The hidden part of it, the part that's not written, is just pronounced, is also the same as what is pronounced. So what that represents is that a mum, what you see on the surface, is a direct reflection of what's beneath the surface. That the external superficial blemish that you see on the Kohen is not just a superficial thing, but it is an emanation of an inner blemish. That there is a moral defect in that Kohen, which is being expressed through the physical defect. And that's why a mum, particularly these blemishes, which are called a mum in Hebrew, are seen as not just something superficial, but an expression of an inner failing. And that's why that person cannot be a Kohen. So again, it's not because he's got long eyebrows, it's that the long eyebrows is an indication of some inner problem that this person has. That's why they cannot be a Kohen. And again, this only applies to a Kohen in the temple. It doesn't apply to anybody else. So we don't, it's not called a mum in the same way when we see long eyebrows in anybody else. We shouldn't come to the conclusion that they have some moral failing as well. So all these interpretations so far are indicating that there is something wrong with this Kohen serving in the temple. There is something missing in him. The first two we saw, Maimonides and the Sefer Chinuch, said that there's not something actually innately defective about this person. He's a lovely guy. But because the temple needs to have a certain presentation, and this person with an external blemish takes away from that presentation or distracts from the meditation that people have to have, so therefore he can't serve in the temple. Those interpretations, the interpretations of the Jewish philosophers, indicate that the Kohen is morally clean, but because he's physically blemished, it's not appropriate to have him in the temple. The Hasidic interpretations, the mystical interpretations we looked at, say further, no, that these are actually signs of an inner blemish, that there is something represented by that external sign. It's God's message to you telling you, do not let that person serve in the temple. There is something that you don't know about, but God does. That's what they mean. There's another interpretation, a very different angle, taken by the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek was the third Rebbe of the Chabad movement, and he has a very, very fascinating work called Derech Mitzvosecha, which is his mystical explanation of the commandments. So he goes through the commandments, not all 613, but a cross-section of them, and explains each one according to the Kabbalistic and the mystical meaning of them. And he started writing this book when he was under 13. He was a very young man when he started writing it, and wrote it over the years. And it's an amazing insight into the commandments, into the mystical idea of the commandments. And he takes on this one as well, and he explains the blemish in a Kohen. He first quotes an idea from the Zohar. The Zohar is the most fundamental of Kabbalistic works, and in the Zohar, it quotes the verses describing the blemish of a Kohen and says something very amazing. It says in the Zohar that every soul in its journey down towards this world is affected by that journey. That the various stages the soul takes to go from its heavenly source all the way down into this physical world, each stage, it takes on certain characteristics. And the Zohar says that just like the moon during the various times of the month waxes and wanes, that during the first half of the month the moon is on the rise, it's getting bigger and growing. It culminates at the full moon halfway through the month, and then it starts to reduce until it disappears at the end of the month. So just like that happens in the physical world, so too in the spiritual world, the divine light called the Shekhinah, the divine presence, has times when it waxes and it wanes. When it is on the up, it's more revealed, and it's on the down where it's becoming lessened. And that corresponds to the first half of the month and the second half of the month. The Zohar says a soul that is born in the first half of the month, when the moon is growing, is going to be a bright, full, complete, healthy soul. Whereas a soul born in the second half of the month, as the moon is being reduced, will have a defect, a blemish on it. The blemish will not actually be in the soul itself, it will be on the body, the physical body of the soul. And that is a soul being born in the second half of the month. That's what it says in the Zohar. Now the Tzemach Tzedek explains that first of all, before people start working out their birthdays, this is not talking, when it says the soul born in the first half, it doesn't mean born in this world. It means there's something called the birth of a soul that's different to the birth of a soul in a body. It's talking about the development of the soul in the heavenly realms. There's a certain point where the soul is ready to come down. That's called the birth of the soul in the heavenly realms. And whether that's in the first half or the second half of the month, none of us know. We may know when we were born in this world, we don't know when our soul was born in that world. And that's what it's talking about. So we don't really know which type of soul we are, a first half or the second half of the month. We don't know. But the Tzemach Tzedek explains what this means is that there are certain souls that are given a very different mission. He says that in war, in tactics of war, when two nations are battling in a war with each other, so there's a very clever war tactic that is used, and that is where one side, in order to conquer the other side, shows a weakness and actually draws the other side into attack position, where they sacrifice some of their own soldiers in order to draw the enemy closer and to give the enemy a certain sense of complacency and comfort. But this is really a trap. That as soon as the enemy has come closer and has been somewhat victorious, is able to make some inroads into your own territory, there's a ruse, a trick that you do, that you then attack from all sides, and you have the enemy close to you, and you're able to conquer the enemy completely. Now, in order to do this tactic, you do have to lose some of your soldiers. There is a certain loss that you have to take, and there will be certain soldiers who have to do the heroic mission of giving themselves up in a way to be taken or killed by the enemy, and this is all in order to draw the enemy close, that you can attack and be completely victorious. And it's a war tactic that Tzemach Tzedek described. He said all physical realities are parallels to spiritual realities as well. And so just like there's a war in this world, so too there's a spiritual war between goodness and evil, between the powers of holiness and the powers of impurity. And this entire world and our entire existence is all about that battle. We are all involved in the battle between good and evil, between the powers of goodness and holiness, divine powers, and the powers of evil and destruction. And so there are certain souls that their job is to be those soldiers who will be conquered somewhat by the enemy, by the powers of evil, in order to draw evil in and then be able to attack evil and conquer it completely. And they are the souls that are blemished. That a soul that is born with a blemish means a soul that has been allowed, the powers of evil were allowed to somewhat capture it and hurt that soul externally. The body is blemished. But this is all in order to draw in the powers of evil and weaken them, so goodness can overcome it in the end. And so these souls are like frontline souls that are sent to the front line. And they're heroes. They're particular hero souls, even though what they go through is painful. But it's only an external blemish. Internally their soul is complete and is pure and has nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It's not a secondary soul in any way. But that blemish was allowed that soul to be on the front line. And that will contribute to the victory of goodness over evil. And so therefore these souls have a very special place in heaven and a special connection to God that other souls do not enjoy. However, it's at a price. They had to be sacrificed for this victory. And so Tzemach Tzedek says these are the souls of the blemished Kohanim, that they don't serve in the temple in the space of holiness, but they are blemished. They have to be outside of the temple, in the world of unholiness. And in a way, that does not indicate a weakness of that soul. On the contrary, it's a strength of that soul. That's one thing to be a holy soul in a holy place in the temple. But what about being a holy soul outside of the temple? That is really on the front lines of battling the powers of unholiness. And so a Kohen that's not allowed to serve in the temple, it's because their job is a different job in combating the powers of evil in the world and bringing holiness into the world. And so in a way that is an honor to that soul, not an insult to that soul whatsoever. The Tzemach Tzedek further says, fascinatingly, that this principle can be applied broader to just the Kohanim, just the priests in the temple. That there are other souls in the world who they also are these souls that were blemished in their body. What does that mean? It means that some of us are given a life of challenge and difficulty. There are some people who come into this world and they're given one challenge after the other. And while we think there are some people who seem to have life very smooth, everything goes very easy and very predictable, and everything's fine for them, there are other people who, one thing after another, they're given obstacles and difficulties and challenges and hard times. Now the truth is, those people who you think have it easy, it's just because you don't know them very well. Most souls are these souls who do have these challenges. It's just we don't know other people's issues, we only know our own. So, but the fact is that there are certain souls who their life is about facing things that are difficult, facing things that are challenging. And this is not a punishment. This is not an expression of some secondary type of soul that's been banished or having a difficult time because you deserve it. It's that there are certain souls who have to be on the front line of the battle with the world of evil. And so therefore they go through difficulty and challenge and darkness and battle it. And sometimes they also fall. Sometimes these souls do fall. They actually sometimes don't make it through. But that's not an expression of failure. That is a part of the battle with evil. And so those souls, like the souls of the Kohanim, are given a very special place and have a very honored place in the world of souls, because they are battling on the front line with goodness. And so not only Kohanim, sometimes these souls that have blemishes, but all of us can also be sometimes that type of soul. And the Tzemach Tzedek says that we should honor these people very greatly. They're very honored souls. Which is a fascinating idea, because we usually look at people suffering as being some type of punishment, and ourselves as well. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction. Why me? Why am I suffering? What did I do wrong? What did I do to deserve this? These are all automatic things that we say. Tzemach Tzedek here is saying that not necessarily you did anything to deserve it. It's not a punishment. It could be that your soul has a particular power to face that darkness and push goodness to a further place. You're the frontline soldier. It's not an insult. It could be an honor. So in a similar way, a Kohen who's blemished, who can't serve in the temple, shouldn't be insulted. Your job is not to be in the temple. Your job is to be outside of the temple, in the world of darkness, and to bring more light and goodness there. And that is your mission.
So is this also that idea that it's all for the good, that it's everything, or does that come from someone else?
The idea that everything's for the good, that is a basic principle of Jewish faith that is found throughout the Talmud. Ideas that everything happens is for the good, everything is about the divine plan. But this is, I guess, another insight into that, and saying why somebody who has a life of difficulty, it could be that is their lot, but not as a punishment or an expression of anything negative about them. It's the strength of their soul.
And so this, you could also apply this then to Mamzer, to some extent, or not?
Well, you can apply it to any life challenge. You can, that this is where you're supposed to be, and even if you're in a position through your own or somebody else's wrongdoing, but now that you're there, this is where you're supposed to be. So yeah. So this idea, the Tzemach Tzedek's idea, it turns around the Kohen with the long eyebrows in a very different way. Not only are we saying, like the philosophers said, that the Kohen did nothing wrong, just it sort of ruins the temple atmosphere, or like the other Hasidic interpretations was that no, actually this is a sign of a deeper problem within that Kohen. The Tzemach Tzedek is saying that on the contrary, this is a sign of a particular power that this soul has. This soul has the power to be in the world of blemish, the world of difficulty, the outside of the temple, and so therefore it is in a way an honor for that soul, albeit in a negative way. You're not allowed in the temple, but that's because your mission is elsewhere. So it's a very powerful idea. And just finally, another interpretation, another Hasidic interpretation from a book called Tiferes Shlomo by Reb Shlomo Radomsker, one of the Hasidic leaders in Poland. He said that if you look carefully at the verse, he gives a bit of a moralistic message from this idea. He says that it says that anyone who has a blemish from the children of Aaron, anyone from the children of Aaron who has a blemish. So the Radomska says that what this means is that anybody who is blemished in their relationship with Aaron HaKohen cannot serve in the temple. What does that mean? It means that anyone who does not live up to the ideals of Aaron HaKohen cannot serve in the temple. Who was Aaron? Aaron was the brother of Moses, who was famous for his ability to bring peace amongst people. That he was called Oyev Shalom V'Roidu Shalom. He loved peace and he sought peace. He was able to unite people. He had an amazing ability to solve conflicts, to bring people together who weren't getting on. He could restore marital harmony. He had the ability to take people who were going through issues and difficulties and to bring them together and make peace. That was his whole identity, that was his whole persona. This was for a deeper reason. Not only was he able to bring peace between people, his whole mission was to bring peace between heaven and earth. between God and the physical reality. As a priest, as a Kohen, his job was to draw down the divine presence into this world. And so that's who his entire being, what he was all about. And so the Radomska says that if you have a blemish in the children of Aaron, meaning if you're blemished in your emulation of Aaron, if you're a person who does not bring peace to the world, if you bring disharmony to the world, so then such a person cannot serve in the temple. That's what the blemish in the children of Aaron means. And so he's talking about it on a more homiletic and symbolistic level, that if there's not peace between body and soul, if the beauty of the soul is not expressed in the body, if there's a disharmony between body and soul, then that's not one of the children of Aaron. That can't be in the temple. The temple has to be a place where ideal and reality fit. They reflect each other. And so the physical blemish on the body represents a disharmony between body and soul. And disharmony can't exist in the temple. Things have to be harmonious. That's why Aaron, who represented harmony, was the one who served in the temple. And we could say that what this means is that somebody who may be spiritually very righteous and very upright, but when it comes to their interpersonal relationships, when it comes to down here in this world, their physical presence in this world, they're blemished in their interaction with other people, such a person can't serve in the temple. You can't think that you can be spiritually close to God, but between people you don't get on. It doesn't work. If you can't be peace between people, so then you can't be in peace between God and the world. And so only somebody who is unblemished in their emulation of Aaron, who's complete in their personification of peace, bring peace into the world, only such a person can serve in the temple. So with all this, may we very soon merit to have the temple back and have the Kohanim serving in the temple, and the unblemished Kohanim who are able to serve in the temple and do their job, may they bring us blessing. And then those blemished Kohanim who have the very holy role of bringing holiness outside of the temple, may they also do their job. Amen. Any questions? Yeah.